This man's story has all of Mexico talking because he made some shocking revelations about powerful people in Mexico. However, not enough people are talking about the actual story. He was a child that grew up in Mexico City's drainage tunnels. Now, his name is Beto. He shared his story in a podcast called Penitencia. And Beto said that he was abandoned when he was only 15 days old. He had never met his mom. He never even actually had a family. He said that when he was 5 years old, he was adopted, but only for about a year. So he was adopted by a government official and his wife. They never had any of the kids of their own. So they kind of took it out on him. Instead of, being loving parents, it was completely hell for him. He said he was treated like a dog, or sometimes even worse than a dog, because his adopted father brutally essayed him and devied him. And he told his adopted mother about this, but either she didn't believe him or she was choosing to ignore it. And he said there was no way that she didn't know, because he was constantly going to bed, in a bed full of pee and his own blood. Now, he said he never really hated this woman because she was living in hell as well. She was being devied horribly by her husband, but he ran away a year later. And he said that's when he started surviving in the streets and ended up in Mexico City's coladeras, or drainage system beneath the city. And it sounds unbelievable, yes, but there are documented communities of people that live in these underground tunnels for decades. There's a really good YT video about this. If you speak Spanish, you can go watch it here. But according to his story, children, adults, they live together, they try to survive together, they share food, they protect each other. But at the end of the day, it's, pretty much everybody for themselves. So by the time he was 7 years old, he already learned how to survive on the streets. He had older friends that taught him how to read, how to write, but also taught him how to steal. So he was committing small crimes just to survive. And he said when he was 9, he met a young girl that became his girlfriend. And every time he would talk about her, there was a smile on his face until the end. And he said, yeah, she was slightly older and she ran away because she was being essayed by her grandpa and her father. Now, he said a little bit after that, they were abducted along with other children, and they were taken to a warehouse where they stayed for about a year and 3 months. And he said in that warehouse, they were completely, constantly being put down. They were forced to exercise. They were abused brutally, but they were also taught how to read and write. Well, I mean, Beto already knew those, but they were taught table manners. They were taught how to speak properly. And they weren't allowed to shower or clean up after themselves. I mean, it sounds really horrible. And according to his story, some of those children didn't survive because if they couldn't handle what was going on, or handle the exercises or whatever, they were unalived and their bodies were thrown away. He said they were thrown away like dogs without any owners, because there was nobody that ever came back to look for them. And sadly, his girlfriend was one of those that didn't survive. Now, he says that when he was 10 years old, his life changed, that he was taken in, cleaned up, given new clothes, like nice clothes, and he was sent to government officials' beds. I think you know what I mean about that. And he said shortly after that, he had a new owner. He's like a dog, I had a new owner. He said at that time, he went back to the man that had adopted him and he unalived him. He said that he removed his fingernails from his hands, from his feet, and the man would beg him to stop, and he would tell him, why would I stop when you didn't stop essaying me when I asked you to stop? Beto reminded him, you're not my father. And he said that was what the man would tell him when he would essay Beto, and Beto would ask him to stop. He's like, well, it's not like you're my son. And the man did ask him for forgiveness. He asked him for compassion, and he reminded him, you never had any for me, so why would I have any for you? And he did burn him alive. Now, he said he went back later on to that lady's house, bought her a new house, took her out to eat. He said he never really hated her, because she suffered at his hands too. Now, Beto said that's when his life completely started all over again. And he said the training that was at the warehouse was to work for the government, but outside the government, doing things illegally. And he said he was taught how to unalive people. He was taught to kidnap kids and babies. And this is the part that made it go viral. He said those babies were bought by big artists, government official for these satanic rituals where they would buy the babies and unalive it for that. And he mentioned Carmen Salinas, which is a huge Mexican actress and government official. She has now since passed away. But of course, the other names that he said were beeped out because those were people that are still alive. Carmen is no longer with us. No. So when since this went viral, her name was taken out at the end. But of those people, he said, I know how they live. I've been to their houses. I've eaten with them. And, he says Carmen Salinas acts like she's a huge Catholic, but she actually, sacrifices to the devil. And she goes to Veracruz, Mexico, which is a place known for that. And that's exactly what she would do with those babies' bodies that she would buy. The woman asked him, like, how did you feel at the time when you were kidnapping these babies, knowing what was going to be done to them? And he said he always felt like he was saving them from the pain that he has endured in his life, because these are kids that didn't have any parents as well, that they didn't really have a family. And she asked him, where did you get these kids, these babies from? And he said the coladeras, so the underground tunnels, the hospitals, just right off the street. Since he was a child, he would go anywhere. He wouldn't stop, in comparison to if they use adults to do this. And he said by the time he was 11 years old, he had his own place in Polanco, which is one of the richest neighborhoods in Mexico City. He said he had money, he had protection, but he never forgot where he came from. So he would constantly go back to the underground tunnels to take them food, diapers. His friends that he had that passed away, he would go and, give them the funeral and make sure their bodies were taken care of. And he said that's the only place where he felt calm, because you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have anybody to share it with, it doesn't really mean anything. He said his boss was one of the only people that gave him encouragement. It's like the first time he felt like he had somebody to share his thoughts with. He would actually get a hug from him in the holidays. And, he would pat him in the back, telling him that, he did a good job. And he said that made him feel like a superhero, because he never really had that before. Now, he said at 17 years old, it was almost time for him to retire, because remember, the work he was doing couldn't be done by adults. So when he was going to turn 18, he was going to step away and do other things. Well, he said they called him in and they told him that he had to unalive his boss. Now, remember, his boss was one of the only families that he ever had. So he told his boss what was going on, and his boss didn't believe him. He's like, what do you mean? I'm super powerful. What do you mean they want to unalive me? Well, he said a month before he turned 18, his life caught up with him. Honestly, if you ask me, they set him up, because he said in 2005 he kidnapped somebody and he was arrested in 2007. Remember, he was being protected. So if they arrested him, it's because the protection was no longer there, and he was sentenced to 72 years in prison. And he says that he lives with trauma, with anger, with regret. Then he says he doesn't have any, I don't know, it's a lot of back and forth, but I understand it's a lot emotionally what he's been through. And he said he never had a childhood, he never had a family, he doesn't know who his mother is, and he says he hates her because he found out that she abandoned him because she was poor. She didn't have any money. And he said, that's not a good enough reason to abandon your baby. He said, we could have survived together. We could have been a team. Even if we ate beans every single day, they could have, had a beautiful life. And he said his childhood dream was to become a pilot. Now, he says he doesn't care if he passes away in prison because he doesn't have anybody in the outside world. And Beto, tells us your destiny is written, just live your life. And he says that he believes in God and he doesn't understand why God brought him into this world. But I really do think that his story is probably the reason why, because now he's bringing attention to these kids that were forgotten. Now, there are still children living in the shadows in Mexico City, because the biggest tragedy is that if it wasn't for him, people wouldn't know about this. These children are never seen and they're being seen now. So since the podcast was released, there was a rumor that he was unalived. It turned out to be completely false. The podcast host said he's fine. She's trying to find ways to help him, and people are updating him in prison, how everybody is reacting to his story. So she really does hope to find a way to help Beto. But this story is completely heartbreaking. If you understand Spanish, you can go read it. If not, this is just, a recap of what was said, because it's an hour-long interview. But I really do hope that Beto's story does bring change to these children that are forgotten completely. But let me know, what do you think in the comments of Beto's story? Do you believe what he said? Do you not believe it? Let me know, what do you think in the comments? I forgot to add, I really believe Beto's story, because for a long time we believed everything that, the things that are surrounding the e-files, or the things that are in the e-files, we didn't believe them. We always thought they were too crazy to be true, and they turned out to be true. So now comparing that to these stories of Carmen Salinas and all the other Mexican, politicians and, powerful people, they are crazy, but they might be true. And some of the Mexico's people are in the e-files. So the correlations are wild. Don't forget to like my video, share it, follow me for more true crime story time and cheese.